Ecosystem services are those benefits that human societies receive from ecosystems. These are things like mangrove swamps that attenuate flooding during storms on coasts, or wetlands that attenuate flooding by rivers by soaking up this sort of shock wave of water that comes down in a flood and preventing it from causing damage to human habitation and infrastructure. Other examples would be filtration of water and catchment of water. So you could imagine a green water catchment in a mountain that fills a dam. If those ecosystems that keep the landscape green didn't exist, you just have a lot of erosion and mud washing down into your dam instead of nice clean water that people could use. Also, the production of the oxygen that we breathe to live, um, the growth of food that we eat. That's a benefit conferred by soil ecosystems. So it's really all the things that allow us to live on the planet are ecosystem services. And the trouble with ecosystem services is that they are often only very noticeable once they're gone if you're not paying close attention to them. So human history has involved a lot of ecosystem degradation and thus the loss of associated ecosystem services. And that's brought us all kinds of problems like the 21st century climate emergency that we're facing. So the importance of ecosystem services is not to be underestimated. And it's important to notice that they are easily taken for granted. So we have to make extra efforts to not take them for granted and to notice them where they exist, because it is indeed within our best interests and not on merely ethical grounds in terms of saving biodiversity and things like that, which are moral or ethical grounds I'd think of as being the traditional driving force behind environmentalist movements. But it's really in our selfish interest as individuals and as societies to conserve ecosystems, which entails conserving the biodiversity, which species are the basic units of ecosystems. And diversity confers resilience to ecosystems. So that's my, in a nutshell, argument for biodiversity as a pragmatic, rather biodiversity conservation as a pragmatic effort to be made by human beings. There's an article I greatly enjoyed by Peter Cariva and Michelle Marvier titled "What is Conservation Science?", where they argue that historically conservation has been about the separation of humans and nature, while today the two are more commonly recognized as being intertwined. And I think this ties in really nicely with the pragmatic need for conservation of ecosystems with the provision of ecosystem services in mind. And Cariva and Marvier say here, when speaking of conservation science in the modern context, they say emerging priorities include pursuing conservation within working landscapes, because we places like farms and urban landscapes, rebuilding public support, working with the corporate sector, and paying better attention to human rights and equity. This is with things like the displacement of indigenous people to create protected areas in mind, which is a bit of a dark history of conservation efforts, as the authors argue. I'll link to this article in the description, and it's well worth a read, and I do recommend it to your attention. Peter Cariva and Michelle Marvier are arguing for the simultaneous increase of human well-being with conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems. And this is in the interest of human societies, as I've argued with reference to ecosystem services. So, what to do with that? What to do with that? One could think how to integrate oneself with ecology, how to integrate oneself with ecosystems. Now, what does that mean? What is an ecosystem? Think of it like a food web. There are primary producers, which tend to be green, right? These are things that capture energy from the sun and turn it into a form that something can eat. And things eat those primary producers. They eat their leaves, or they eat their fruits, their nectar, and other things eat those things, and your food web emerges. So if you have a garden or plants, you have green organisms around you. You have the foundation of an ecosystem. And you can think of your area of influence, whether it's your home or your work or wherever else you go, and try and see things in terms of ecology. Try and see the relationships between living organisms. I like to imagine I was a astronaut floating in a little space station. I think, well, what would I need to survive there? How could I survive in a little bubble, in a little capsule? What would be the minimum amount of space? Well, maybe there's some kinds of machines and so on, some technical solutions which I'm just unaware of, but all the machinery for producing the conditions that the human organism lives in are actually around us. And Buckminster Fuller used to describe Earth as a giant spaceship hurtling through space that we're all riding on. And I think it's an apt analogy here. We're surrounded by this complex network of biological machinery which creates the conditions that we live in. Now, getting back to our capsule, we'd need food to eat. So that's energy, right? It's energy to run our muscles, our brains, and all the functions of our bodies. So where does that come from? Well, that comes from the sun. And if the sun's shining somewhere in space, then that's available to us. Then that energy is taken with carbon dioxide that we exhale and fixed into starches and sugars and all the other nutrients, all the other micronutrients and minerals and things like that. They just cycle. They just cycle in these systems. They're not coming into existence and then disappearing. They're just passing from one form to the next, and that indeed is the role of a lot of the soil fauna that I like to focus on. They keep these cycles moving. They decompose dead matter, and they take the basic components of it and make it available to something else to incorporate it into its own tissues. They turn it into components of the soil, which become available to plants. The only thing flowing into the system from outside is the energy flowing in from the sun. And energy is flowing out from the planet into space. Everything else is just cycling. So in my mind, there's no reason why you couldn't have a modular version of that same sort of system. This microcosm in our hypothetical space station. So try and imagine this little capsule, this little space station that just has you on it, and it has some sort of garden. It has soil. It has precipitation. There's water vapor in the air which falls down and wets the ground. It's a miniature planet that's just big enough to support you and all the other creatures which are components of this system. Because make no mistake, you are also one of these creatures. You're also a component of an ecosystem. You're also a part of ecology. Now, imagine your little microcosm, and say you add one more person to it, and now you've expanded its size. You've increased its carrying capacity. And then you add another person, and another, and so on until you've added some 7 billion people or whatever we're at now, and then you get the world that we live in. Now, there are ways that you can interact with the system. You can enjoy the services that it offers, as we've discussed, but you can also provide services to ecosystems, as I've heard them called. You can also maintain the soil. You can try and facilitate the functioning of ecosystems, or you can hinder it. You could say douse your garden with a general pesticide that wipes out all the little critters that you can't see that maintain the functioning of your soil, or you could leave your porch lights on all night so that they draw nocturnal insect life off of your garden to die while their navigation systems are confused by the artificial light. You could buy your food from farmers and distributors who engage in damaging practices, who engage in industrial agriculture, which destroys the soil to offer some short-term profits before moving on to the next place. The United Nations, I'll link to this below as well. The United Nations, for instance, acknowledges that we have some 60 years left before the world, the population of the world, the human population of the world, faces starvation from soil degradation because of these sort of short-sighted farming practices that have been engaged in for so long. So while you, like me, are just a drop in the ocean, I don't know who to credit this quote to, but what is the ocean if not a multitude of drops? There is something that you can do, however small, to try and fight for the things that allow us to live on this planet, to fight the crusade of the soil, for lack of a better term. And I challenge you to try and find ways to do that in your life, and to take those opportunities. Because if too many of us fail in that, then we do face a pretty ugly conclusion to this whole experiment that has been humanity. So in a way, we have an unprecedented opportunity to allow future generations to keep on living on this planet, and to hopefully live happy and fulfilled lives. So we have an opportunity to provide a great service to uncounted numbers who may come after us. And all we have to do is act in our own interest because it happens to align with their interest as well, and with the interest of all these other things that we live with. That little turtle dove, this loquat tree, that aloe, the lawn, and the whole Afro-temperate forest down below me, and the mountain fambus up in the hills, and all my lovely neighbors in their houses. Now, I hate to be preachy. I hate to sound preachy. But we do all have a sphere of influence, and we might as well do as much good with it as we can. So with that in mind, I will start making a few videos about creatures you might find around the home that you can be welcoming to. Now, I'm under no illusion that sort of thing will make or break conservation efforts globally for the survival of humankind. I think we've inherited some bad ideas from some misinformation campaigns around carbon footprints and so on that put the onus on the individual when, as far as I can tell, the onus really lies on bigger decision-making bodies like big business and those sorts of fat cats. But I would guess that any little bit helps, and these things are also just fun. This stuff is fun. It's it's so much nicer liking the natural world than feeling icky about it. Now, a lot of people, when you talk about wildlife in the natural world, they think of like big furry animals, like or pretty birds singing, or maybe just a lawn, something like that. You got to realize that most of wildlife, 97%, is invertebrates. So it's creepy crawlies. It's things that are very often perceived as just pests, as things that we'd be better off without, while they really are the things that keep us alive and that allow us to live here. So there's something intrinsically rewarding about liking those things and having a good relationship with them. There's a lot of good that it can do, and there's no harm in it. So with that said, let's have a look at what we can find around the house.